Good evening, everyone, or if you're not here on the left coast, then good afternoon or whatever it may be, wherever you are. But we're really glad that you have joined us today. My name is Kaji Dosha, and I am really grateful to join this really important conversation today. And when I heard the invitation and when I saw that we were talking about putting white supremacy on trial, I was like, yes. And I love that we're talking about bringing fundamental change to this country. So I'm going to do a little bit of introduction here, and just so you get situated to the time, I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to pass things over to our amazing host and Rabbi Felicia, and then we will hear from our incredible guests. So that's the arc of things, and I am a preacher, and I'm going to do everything I'm supposed to stick within the time I have been allotted. So anyway, I love that the neo-Nazi hate groups are having to right now endure discovery. As someone who's in discovery as well in my own lawsuit, I realize how agonizing the process is, and I just love that the neo-Nazis are having to deal with that. I love that they're experiencing financial accountability. So I just want to thank first Rabbi Felicia and Congregation B'nai Jeshurun and IFA and all of our amazing co-hosts for the great honor of joining you tonight. Just a tiny bit about me, in case you couldn't tell, I am a Black woman. And I am incredibly and ridiculously privileged to serve the Park Avenue Christian Church as the congregation, which is about 212 years old, first woman in the senior role, in the role of senior pastor. And along with many of you, I volunteer my time with the New Sanctuary Coalition, which is an organization I've co-chaired for the better part of about 11 or 12 years now. And we in our work combat white supremacy by putting a halt to white supremacist immigration policies and enforcement and removals. And we effectively stop deportations because our folks who are immigrants come to know the law through the work we do in our pro se clinic here in New York City, and also for a time at our southern border as we responded to the so-called migrant caravan in Tijuana, Mexico, but of course across our southern border. And because of this work, evolving white supremacist policies attempted to chill my speech and halt these ministries through very specific and terrifying targeting, which included my detention, interrogation, and ongoing surveillance from Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and Customs and Border Patrol, as even a federal judge has acknowledged in my own lawsuit, which is Dosha v. DHS. You can look up, I'm represented by Arnold and Porter and Protect Democracy. So I guess we can say that together we are joining in taking white supremacy to court. And because we need and work to create sanctuary as a way of life, as respite, as a threat to hatred and violence. And I evoke that word as we think about sanctuaries we can't occupy, of course, thanks to a killer disease that's fueled by the idiocy and inherent violence that we've been exposed to by white supremacists who are just in charge of too much right now. So here I am, a Black woman joined by interfaith partners, convened by a synagogue, asking how and listening to how we can vanquish this wickedness through the means at our disposal. Or as my friend, the theologian Ebony Marshall Terman put it, it's time to stomp the devil back to hell. Excuse my language. And there are millions, if not billions of dollars, I believe right now, being spent to tear apart generations old alliances between Black and Jewish and Muslim people, of course, recognizing there to be overlap between these groups, and to prevent the strong allegiances that we've yet to even imagine. And to build the relationships as we're doing right now does threaten the very notion of evil, which works very hard to maintain and to grow its strength. But these times are calling for something different, maybe even for something we've never seen before. And it begins with hope. Hope that isn't vacuous or devoid of reality. But no, it's hope, as Professor Willie Jennings at Yale puts it, hope is not a feeling or a sentiment. Hope is something we are disciplined by. And I believe it's the discipline of hope that pulls us out of the sense of listlessness and paralyzing fear and reminds us that when weeping spends the night, when it seems like the doors are closed and the end is near, joy comes in the morning. And I get great joy learning about this incredible work that our guests are doing today. So thank you. What a joy it is now to turn the conversation over to my new friend and incredible, amazing colleague, Rabbi Felicia Soul. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Kanji, and we're really excited to gather together with many communities across faith lines and anyone who's joined us we have someone from Australia, so we're all over the world. Welcome, everyone. We're really happy at B'nai Jeshurun to partner with Integrity First America. This is the second time we've gathered together. The last time was in our sanctuary about 1.5 years ago. With sadness, we're obviously not in the sanctuary together, but it doesn't mean the work isn't as important, or all the more so that we find ways to keep ourselves apprised of all the ways we're trying to take down white supremacy in this country of ours, so desperately needed. So I want to welcome everyone once again, and in just a moment, I'll introduce our incredible speakers. And I want to say during the course of this evening, we'll be fielding questions through the Q&A. So the questions will go to the wonderful staff of Integrity First, Serena Jezior, and Meirav Levy-Bernstein and Allison Amers, who have been so generous in the lead up towards this evening. So thank you to them. And there will be a time for question and answer, but in the beginning of the evening, we'll just hear from our panelists and our incredible women who are doing this great work. So let me take the opportunity to introduce them. I think many of them are not new to you, but let me share a little bit about them. First, we have Roberta Kaplan, Robbie, as she's often known. Robbie Kaplan is the founding partner at Kaplan, Hecker and Fink, a formidable litigator with decades of experience in both commercial and civil rights litigation. She is perhaps best known for representing Edith Windsor in the landmark case United States versus Windsor, in which the Supreme Court held that a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, landing the first major victory in the battle for marriage equality. In addition to working with clients like Columbia University, Airbnb, Uber, Vice Media, and T-Mobile, Robbie helped to launch the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund to provide legal representation to women who have experienced sexual harassment. Robbie is the author of Then Comes Marriage, United States versus Windsor, and The Defeat of DOMA, chosen by the LA Times and Ms. Magazine as one of the top 10 books of 2015. Robbie is most proud of her award, receiving an honorary doctorate from the Jewish Theological Seminary. So welcome, Robbie. Karen Dunn is a partner at Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. She is widely recognized as one of the country's top trial lawyers and experts in crisis management, helping her clients solve their biggest problems both in and out of the courtroom. As the American lawyer noted when naming Karen a 2017 Litigator of the Year, she specializes in high stakes, high profile, and hard fought cases. In the past several years alone, Karen has secured important trial wins in difficult cases for some of the country's most prominent technology companies, including Uber, Apple, and Oracle. Karen previously served in all 3 branches of government as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, associate White House counsel under President Barack Obama, communications director to then Senator Hillary Clinton, and law clerk to Judge Merrick B. Garland of the DC Circuit, who should be on our Supreme Court, and to Justice Stephen G. Breyer of the Supreme Court. She has received numerous awards, and we're so excited to have her here. And finally, Amy Spitalnick, the executive director of Integrity First for America. Amy Spitalnick is the executive director of IFA, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who threaten longstanding principles of our democracy, including our country's commitment to civil rights and equal justice. Amy joins IFA with well over a decade of experience in government politics and advocacy. She previously served as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General, communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and communications director in the New York State Senate. Amy frequently appears in national media. She is a Truman National Security Project partner, a New Leaders Council faculty member, a 2017 Women in Power Fellow at the 92nd Street Y, and the 2008 Dutco Fellow for Policy and Public Service. We're really excited to have all three of these incredible women, and of course, they are partnering, both Robbie and Karen are partnering with Integrity First for America to sue the 24 neo-Nazi white supremacists and hate groups responsible for the violence that took place in Charlottesville in 2017, August of 2017. Trial is scheduled for October 2020. So thank you for being here with us. We're really grateful for your time and, more importantly, for your work. So I just wanted to start out, for those, some of us were there a year and a half ago at BJ, others of us are new to the case. So could you just give kind of an overview of the who, what, where, when, why of the case, and then we'll go from there. Who's going to start?
Go ahead, Kara. You want to start?
I'm going to say you should kick it off. Go ahead.
So, you know, given the absolutely calamitous world that we live in today, and the fact that we're all doing this by Zoom rather than being able to gather together, the events of Charlottesville in August 2017, I have to say, feel incredibly distant. So let me remind people of what happened, and then I'm going to, as we go through the evening, I can explain why in reality, much of what happened in Charlottesville is still happening today. Charlottesville was not an accident. It was not a protest gone bad. It was not a riot. What happened in Charlottesville was a carefully planned, coordinated effort, for the first time really ever, of multiple alt-right groups and their leaders, from neo-Nazis to KKK members to militia groups, kind of the who's who of the extreme far-right white supremacist movements. Emboldened by recent events and emboldened by a so-called debate about removing Civil War monuments in Charlottesville, to all gather from all over the country, really from all over the country, in Charlottesville the days of August 11 and August 12th, and to commit violence. And you know, it's often, of course, people don't know what's in someone's head. So you could say to me, well, how do I know that? I know that because they all used a gaming platform, an internet platform known as Discord, to plan for weeks in advance what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, going down to details about what they were going to wear and what kind of transportation they were going to have and what kind of weapons they were going to bring. They then all showed up in Charlottesville as planned. They did a torchlit rally on the campus of UVA on Friday night, August 11th, which may have been probably the scariest thing that happened in certain ways during the entire weekend, and we can go into that more in detail about that. At the time that was happening, there was an interfaith group at the church across the street with kids and rabbis and pastors. Cornell West was there, a whole bunch of other people, and they were basically blockaded in the church because they were so afraid that if they left, they would succumb to the violence that was happening across the street. And then the violence, not surprisingly, only continued the next day with, to some degree, almost open warfare on the streets of Charlottesville, leading, as everyone knows, to James Field, again, a very reminiscent thing, driving his car into a group of protesters, killing Heather Heyer, and injuring a number of our plaintiffs in our case. And what our case is about is not attacking the participants as individuals. Some of them have been prosecuted for crimes, including, of course, James Fields, who will spend the rest of his life in prison. But to go after the organized conspiracy that caused it, that led to it, and that actually occurred. And so we filed our case really quickly in October 2017, just a few months after it happened. And we've been litigating it ever since, and we're going to go to trial in October.
Let me pick up on one thing that Robbie said, which is, I think about this all the time. So for a large portion of the time that we've been litigating, which it's hard to believe it's been 3 years, you know, we sort of have felt a little bit like we're living in our own world where we monitor the dark web and we have reviewed evidence about the planning, the premeditation, and the coordination of the white supremacist movement and the neo-Nazi movement and the leadership and their actions. And we have felt more or less like this was playing out off to the side and in our own little bubble, putting our case together so that we can try it and get a jury verdict in October. But today, you know, every day when you read the paper, you see what's going on more and more on the streets in cities, not just Charlottesville, but cities all across the country. You realize that much of what was on display, the difficulty, the anger, the violence is in some ways playing out much more on the surface in other places around the country. And so themes that we have been dealing with as lawyers and as people very immersed in the events in Charlottesville in particular, you know, we now see this essentially everywhere we look. And so, you know, we're first of all so grateful to be talking to you tonight, and we're so grateful to our hosts, of course, but also really grateful that all of the people who decided to come and hear about our case did that, because this case is so current. I mean, our lawsuit is based on the Ku Klux Klan Act, a statute that should have absolutely no relevance in the year 2020, but unfortunately is incredibly relevant. And so the more that we can do, not just to litigate our case and prosecute our case, but the more we can do to make sure people know about this case and know about what happened, I think the more that we feel that we're meeting our commitments and doing our job for our plaintiffs.
Thanks. I'm curious, like Robbie, you said we moved very quickly. Like, how does Robbie Kaplan know Karen Dunn, work with Integrity First America to move quickly? Like, for people who are not living in lawyer land, and how does one decide what the angle of the case is so quickly? Like, and my second question is, like, what does today look like for you?
Well, let me tell, I guess the easiest way to tell, first of all, I'm not really known for being slow about anything. It's probably one of my greatest faults as a human being. I don't spend a lot of time to kind of consider things and to pause the way I should. So everything I do, unfortunately, is probably fast and often too fast. But
it's
what
working
happened,
well for some of America, so.
It's not a bad quality for a lawyer, maybe for a human being, not so much. But what happened, quite honestly, is that I had just started my new law firm. And we had just moved into our office in the Empire State Building. I think we moved in on August 7th. The events in Charlottesville happened on August 11 and 12. That was a Friday and Saturday. And then that next Monday, I think so, it was the 14th, I decided, I had 6 employees total then. We were working on card tables. But I decided that I really wanted the firm to be dedicated to serving the public interest and doing legal work in the public interest. And so I said, at lunch, let's order in some pizzas and watch the coverage of what happened over the weekend in Charlottesville. In retrospect, that was a bit of a mistake because one of the paralegals at least kind of got so upset by the coverage that she ran out crying, which was understandable. I don't know if people remember what it was like right after Charlottesville, but it was shocking to see what we saw happening on the streets of an American city. I know it was shocking for African Americans. It certainly was shocking for Jews. And as I was watching it, I thought to myself, well, something needs to happen here. Something needs to be done about this. And I was concerned, I think rightly so, that the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, which is the agency of the government that would normally kind of be right on top of this, probably wasn't going to focus on it. The Attorney General then was Jeff Sessions, and they had other priorities in terms of what the Civil Rights Division wanted to do. So I thought back right away to a case that I had been at Paul Weiss, ironically enough, for more than 2 decades, that my mentor at Paul Weiss, a guy by the name of Marty London, had done against a website known as the Nuremberg Files. That was the early days of the internet, but again, you see all these parallels. The Nuremberg Files was a website that put up photos of doctors who performed abortions, mostly in the South and in the West, along with their personal information, their residence, etc. And then as those doctors got attacked, and one of them was killed, as I recall, the website would put a red X over their names. And the theory of that case is that this was an incitement to violence. They tried it in Portland, Oregon. They won. They won huge judgments against these organizations. They went up on appeal at least twice, but the judgments were ultimately sustained. And then the people on that team for many, many years kind of chased every single defendant down to make sure that they collected every penny as a deterrent to that kind of anti-women violence, really, which is what it was. And so I thought to myself, well, could you do something like that here? I called up, people probably know her because she writes so beautifully. I called up my friend Dahlia Lithwick, who now lives in Brooklyn, but at that time had lived for many years in Charlottesville. That's why I called her. And I said, Dahlia, I have this idea, thinking about a case. What do you think? She said, I think it's a great idea. Why don't you come down? I will put you in touch with a whole bunch of people down here. But it's ironic that you're calling me now because we're literally just packing the van to move to Brooklyn. They have two sons, and we've decided that we can no longer live in this environment. The hatred is just too scary, and we don't want to raise our kids here. And Dahlia now lives in Brooklyn. Her sons go to Heschel. So within about 48 hours of that call, we were on a flight. Myself and a couple of colleagues were on a plane to Charlottesville. The town, which is, for people who haven't been there, really a beautiful, charming college town. But people were still in a real state of shock. There was palpable fear on the streets, particularly in the African-American neighborhoods. A lot of the alt-right people involved in Charlottesville traveled to Charlottesville and moved around Charlottesville in these white vans that they had rented. And those white vans were still traveling through the African-American neighborhoods, and people were petrified. We met with a whole bunch of people. A number of those people became our plaintiffs. They decided that they wanted to do this. We told, and this is truly the tribute to their bravery. We said to each one of them, look, if you need money, you've been horribly injured. If you need to get money, you need to get it fast. This is not the right case for you. We don't know that the defendants will ever be able to pay the judgments we get. We know it's going to take a long time to get it. You may have a claim against the police. You may have a claim against University of Virginia, depending on the circumstances. Go ahead and do that case. That's fine, but then you can't do this case. And each one of them agreed to that and signed up, including at least 4 people who were hit by James Field's card. So it's really a tribute to them and their bravery. And then I got back to New York, and the first thing I did getting back was to call Karen Dunn and say, you want to sue a bunch of Nazis with me? And the reason I called Karen is because I knew she had expertise on the free speech issues, which I know the defendants were going to argue as a defense. And she'd been a prosecutor in Virginia. So she was the perfect person to do this. And I think she agreed almost on the spot.
And in terms of Integrity First for America, IFA was conceived of in 2017, understanding that there would be a significant vacuum in civil rights litigation. Cases that might, in normal times, be brought by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and given sort of the weight that they deserve from our government, were clearly not going to have the level of priority, to put it politely, that I think many of us would expect them to or want them to. And so IFA was this idea that existed in 2017. And when Robbie had this idea for the Charlottesville case, it seemed like a no-brainer that this would be the central piece of litigation that IFA would support. and take on. And it is the only case that we are doing because we just think it's too important, it's too resource intensive, and the impacts of this case are going to have national implications on so many different fronts that, again, this case is really too important for us to take on anything else.
Great, thanks. Karen, could you kind of get us up to date? That was 2017, quick response post Charlottesville. Like, where are you now in terms of litigation, and what has happened in the interim? Because from what I understand, there have been a number of wins along the way. Unmute.
I have to unmute. I try not to interrupt any of my fellow speakers. So, well, the first thing that I would say is actually to your last question, which is one thing that enabled us to move very quickly, is the fact that much of the defendant's planning and plotting took place, as Robbie said, on this chat platform called Discord. And many of those chats were released into the public by a participant in one of these private chat rooms under the name Unicorn Riot. So Unicorn Riot released publicly a large number of these Discord chats, which enabled us to put together the story of what happened on the weekend of August 11th and 12th and the planning that led up to it in the complaint. And the complaint, which is available on the IFA website, remains the only place until our trial where the entire story of what happened in Charlottesville and the planning that led to Charlottesville is told in detail, including with the defendant's own words and with their own, their own pictures and posts that they put up on Discord. So first of all, that's where we started. And that's one reason we were able to file a complaint that was sufficiently detailed to be held up by the judge on the motion to dismiss. So the defendants came in, they moved to dismiss our case on both conspiracy grounds and on First Amendment grounds. They lost on both counts. Robbie argued the conspiracy, I argued the First Amendment. And the judge said that if we can prove at trial what we alleged in the complaint, then we will be successful in our case, and that's what we aim to do. And he also put the lie to the defendant's favorite defense, which is that they were just exercising their First Amendment rights. And he made very clear that violence, and this is pretty well established law and certainly law in the Fourth Circuit, that violence is not protected by the First Amendment. And so what we have alleged is a conspiracy, not a conspiracy of words, but conspiracy to do violence. Violence that was premeditated and violence that was executed. And so since that time, after our victory on the motion to dismiss stage, we have fought tooth and nail to get discovery, to get information, documents, devices, and depositions from the defendants. And as you might suppose, these are not the most law-abiding people ever to have graced the planet. And so they don't so willingly give up their devices and their documents, and they don't so willingly give up the truth. But we have been in pursuit of all of those things. In the course of that, we have brought numerous sanctions motions, and we have won those as well. We had sort of an incredible moment for a civil case. I was a criminal prosecutor before this, as Robbie mentioned, and I did cases like this. I did, national security cases and conspiracy cases. And this is a civil case where we actually got one of the defendants held in civil contempt and thrown into jail and fined a lot of money. And in a civil case, that just never happens. And that was, at this point, not even for the conduct that's at issue in this lawsuit, it was for the discovery violations, for not giving us the information that we're entitled to, and frankly, for going into court in hearings on these issues and repeatedly lying to the court. And we cross-examined him, and the judge is a really good, thoughtful judge, and he just knows a liar when he sees one. And so we have won on the sanctions. We are right now in the midst of incredibly intense discovery. While Robbie and I get to sit here and talk to you, many of our colleagues and teammates have been defending and taking depositions of the defendants in our case and of their associates. of people, who participated in these events, and of people who are involved in these groups that we have also sued, the leading neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups. And so this is a very intensive period of fact discovery, where we're going to gather all of the facts that we need to put together a winning case to go to trial in October. We always get questions. So first of all, I love to try cases. I'm a trial lawyer, and this is like one of the only cases I've ever participated in that I know for a 100% certainty is going to trial, because there's no way to settle with the other side. So we're looking ahead to that, and we're going to be working very hard to get prepared.
I just always think that Karen and Robbie are so modest when this question comes up. This has been, as was mentioned, nearly 3 years of litigation. And if you look at our website, at IFA's website, under the newsroom section, you can see time and time again how Karen and Robbie and their teams have gone to court to hold these defendants accountable, to make sure they hand over that evidence, including their phones, their computers, their social media and email accounts. And they have won every single time, not just in ensuring our plaintiffs get the evidence they're entitled to, but as Karen mentioned, ensuring that the defendants are held accountable when they don't comply with those court orders. And so I would encourage you to check out the newsroom section of IFA's website and really take a look at all of our legal team's incredible wins in recent years, or recent months especially.
I just popped into my head. I don't know if people watching have seen the movie Jojo Rabbit. I watched it since under quarantine, because we watch a lot of movies now lately with my family. And I swear to God, this isn't off. The defendants in this case are kind of like the Nazis in Jojo Rabbit. I mean, it's like suing really immature, really evil Nazis of 14-year-olds. I mean, their maturity level is 14-year-olds. So they do things like, lie to judges, lie in sworn depositions, take the stand, and basically, we just put in some papers just now about the alt-right guy Milo, who probably people have heard of, who basically admitted on a podcast last night that he completely lied to us about a subpoena. And he said he could do that because I'm supposedly a high-priced lawyer for the ADL. Not true, by the way. Neither high-priced nor for the ADL. But it really is kind of a surreal world that we live in this case, because, in most cases, people generally respect the courts and respect the law and comply with court orders. And here it's completely topsy-turvy. We've been dealing that for, as Amy and Karen said, for 3 years.
But I have to say, the hearing, so, we're not going to get to cross-examine most of these guys until trial, but the evidentiary hearings over the discovery violations, where we did get to do some cross-examination, it's like the most fun, easiest cross-examination that ever lived, because it's just this, this was one of the lead organizers of the violence in Charlottesville, and he was literally incapable of telling the truth. But and some of the things he said were just like, if it weren't for the circumstances, they would be very funny. But he sat 2 feet from the judge and looked him in the eye and just lied to him repeatedly. And so, we are really lucky. We have a judge in this case who's been on the bench for decades. He's very thoughtful and he's very serious. And he's just not going to tolerate people who come, take an oath to tell the truth, and then do the opposite of that.
Great, thank you. So both of you, both Karen and Robbie, have pointed out that what seemed far away is actually right in front of our faces in many ways, and has been exposed, I think, in ways that felt like, in some sense, one moment in time in Charlottesville, and now feels like every moment in time in a certain sense, both with the Black Lives Matter movement and the killing of George Floyd and what's happened with protests. And also, I would say, before we open the webinar, just even the fact that there's something called Zoom bombing, right? That we're living in a time, both that white supremacists seem to be on the attack in very in many forms, and in COVID, there's like a whole nother layer of both potential and I don't know, potential. There's been an increase in many ways. So I just would love for you to speak to what's happening on the streets in terms of the way the country has kind of lit up around Black Lives Matter and the protests that are happening, and what white supremacists have done with those protests, and also the fact that we're online so much, and how white supremacists have shown up in the online space due to COVID.
So it's clear, at least it's clear to me today, that so much of what happened in Charlottesville is really a harbinger, sadly, for so much of what we're seeing today. From the use of social media platforms to organize hate and to create a movement for hate, to use of car attacks into protesters, which now seems to be almost a daily occurrence, to fights over Civil War monuments, extremely important issue that's going on today in our country, to the supposed threat of Antifa, which is supposedly, which so many people on the right today say is really what's behind all the protests. Obviously not true, but it was said exactly the same way by the defendants in our Charlottesville case. The problem is we didn't deal with it after Charlottesville. It happened, there were several days of press. People talked about it from time to time, maybe on the anniversaries, but we as a country didn't deal with it. It's just gotten worse and worse and worse. And now we're seeing the ramifications of that today, almost every day on our city streets and all throughout the nation.
And to sort of put a fine point on what Robbie just said, I think if you look at both the cycle of white supremacist violence since Charlottesville, and that includes Poway, Pittsburgh, El Paso, Christchurch, and what's happened during both the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests, it's impossible to separate out what the tactics used in Charlottesville, and specifically the individuals and groups who are responsible for Charlottesville that this case takes on, from what's happening now. So we know, for example, that the Pittsburgh shooter, before he killed 11 people praying in synagogue a year and a half ago, communicated on social media on a site called Gab with some of the Charlottesville leaders. We know that the Christchurch shooter, who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque about a little over a year ago, painted onto his gun a symbol known as the hashtag that one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach, first popularized. Christchurch, in turn, inspired Poway and El Paso. So on this cycle goes, in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. And we see in virtually all of these cases, the defendants in our suit, the Charlottesville leaders, squarely in the center of what has happened. And similarly, during both coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter protests, we see it again. A few examples: during coronavirus, we know that members of National Socialist Movement, which is one of our defendants, a neo-Nazi hate group, were responsible for so many instances of hate and violence. Two key examples: one of their members tried to bomb a hospital in Missouri that was treating coronavirus patients in March. Another was the neo-Nazi in that now viral photo of a guy holding a "Jews are the real plague" sign with an anti-Semitic rat and yarmulke and Star of David graphic. Of course, the two of them met at an NSM rally last year, because this is a very interconnected world made all the more easy by social media. And likewise, during the Black Lives Matter protests, we see the same sort of attempts at disinformation, hate, and violence by our defendants and many of their friends. I think one of the best examples, which is both horrifying and really an example of the times, is Identity Europa, one of the defendants in our suit, was responsible for this viral tweet that claimed to be from Antifa, encouraging violence and looting in white neighborhoods. And it was just meant to help spur racial tensions, and as it was successful in encouraging a number of sort of far right armed extremists to show up and quote unquote fight Antifa. And so over and over again, we see how the defendants in our lawsuit are truly at the center of this movement, both from the cycle of white supremacist attacks and the various attempts to exploit the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests. And so we know, by taking them on through this suit and bankrupting and dismantling them through the large civil judgments we're going to win at trial this fall, this case is going to have impacts that go well beyond Charlottesville. It will have a major national impact on the ability of these individuals and groups to operate. It has already had. We had Richard Spencer, for example, speaking in court the other week about how the case has been financially crippling. Some of the groups have talked about how they can't open a new headquarters because of the lawsuit, helped stop Charlottesville 3.0, as they called it. There's so many examples of how the case has already had major legal, financial, and operational impacts on these groups. And there's actually a blog post on our website where you can read about it. But all that does is speak to just how central these individuals and groups are to this violent movement, and how by bankrupting and dismantling them through this case, it can have major impacts that go well beyond Charlottesville.
Great. I want to pick up on what you said, Robbie, that we haven't dealt with it. What would it mean to deal with it? You know, on the one hand, you are bringing a litigation case, like through the law and so I'm curious from your perspective, both in terms of this case and what does transformational change look like in this country in 2020 to deal with it? Because obviously we have 400 years of certain dealings. We have the arrival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 19th century. Like, what would it actually look like to you to deal with it?
So the first thing I think we need to do, Rabbi, honestly, is we need to name it. I think the big mistake that we all collectively made after Charlottesville was not acknowledging the scope and seriousness of the problem, not understanding that there was this growing movement of mostly men who used to be, you know, kind of hang out playing video games in their parents' basements, who are now communicating with each other and organizing with each other online and finding kinship with each other in their racism and their anti-Semitism and their hatred. And that was a huge problem for this country and a huge security problem for this country, no different than other problems that we've had in this country with foreign terrorists, quite frankly. One benefit, I think, of this trial, I mean, we will bankrupt them for sure, as Amy said, but there's another real benefit to trials in our country, and that is to tell the story using the time-worn standards that courtrooms use, using the rules of evidence, using testimony under oath. We're going to have experts take the stand and explain all this. And I very much hope, as if we already don't have a wake-up call, that this will be very much a wake-up call to this country, that this is a crisis. And this is a crisis that has to be dealt with systematically nationwide, the way that we have to deal with other crises like COVID and Black Lives Matter and everything else that's so tragic going on in our country today.
Yeah. I think that there is a distinct lack of awareness, and some of that may be willful unawareness of the magnitude of these feelings and the violence that they are causing. I mean, Amy's discussion about how interlinked all of these violent episodes are with each other. So it is not, you know, it's not by happenstance that this case is a very large conspiracy case. So not only is this not accidental, it is so much more prevalent than people understand, and it is so much more interconnected and interwoven than anybody really understands. Even when we talk to groups who are very interested, like, they don't even know the half of it. And frankly, unless you spend your days like we do, you know, reading the dark web and looking at these, you know, most of the time private or group chats, you will not know. And so that is one thing. And the second thing really is to recognize what is criminal conduct. I mean, our little civil lawsuit is having an incredible impact, well beyond, you know, what generally you can get in the civil system. But I do think you know, the legislatures have to take a very hard look at what they are calling criminal activity, especially as these sorts of violent crimes, you know, become more and more prevalent in many more communities.
Great. So I'm going to start responding some of the questions that are coming up. I want to address the question, like, should you, please God, you win this case? And it's been more named, and kind of the sense of accountability is raised up through the adjudication of the case and hopefully the win, in addition to all the wins you've had up until this point. Do you think there's any impact on what the accountability will be for elected officials who spout white supremacist ideas? And even though we couldn't necessarily say they caused violence in the sense that Charlottesville, do you think there will be any change in accountability from government officials? Someone asked about, obviously, the president and other members of Congress.
I can jump in. Look, I think it's impossible to look at what happened in Charlottesville and what has happened since without understanding the ways in which these individuals and groups feel so emboldened right now. Karen mentioned earlier that the statute we're using in our suit, the central statute, is something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. And in some ways, when you think about the images of sort of the hate and the violence that spurred that law nearly 150 years ago, there was some shame there. They wore white hoods. They met in the woods. Now you have these white supremacists who are out there in the open, marching with their faces out there, their names out there, and very little shame. And in some, we've talked about a bunch about the role of the internet and allowing them to connect and emboldening them in that way, but you can't ignore the ways in which so much of the ideology they believe has become mainstreamed in parts of our discourse. I think, as Robbie said earlier, the most important thing that we can do right now is call it out, point to it by name, make clear that when we're seeing words from elected officials, policies that are rooted in white nationalism, we need to call it out, we need to say what it is, and we need to connect it to this broader fight. And similarly, as you look at what's happening on our streets, we finally have this much needed public reckoning, or at least the beginning of a much needed public reckoning around these issues of racial injustice in America. You need to see it in the context of the broader white supremacy that that poisons so much of what we do, and that manifests not just in police brutality or in so many of the other ways that are now finally being discussed, but also in the sorts of acts of violence and hate and terror that we've been discussing here. And so understanding the interconnectedness of sort of this deep-seated white supremacy in our country, calling it out, no matter where it rears its ugly head, no matter whether it comes from an elected official or is much more explicit in the ways that we are talking about here, is on all of us to do. And I think it's particularly important to understand how it's on all of us to do because all of our fates are so deeply intertwined here. This is, we're 4 Jewish women talking about this, but every single community, as Pastor Dosha said, is deeply affected by this, and we can't fight one form of hate without fighting all forms of hate because our fates are so intertwined here. And so I think recognizing when you see that form of hate, even if it isn't against your own community, from an elected official or someone else, you have an obligation to do something. And I think in many ways this case is emblematic of that because of the sort of intersectionality, for lack of a better term, of the defendant's own hate.
Yeah, I mean, I have a confession and an apology to make because I remember when I first heard the word intersectionality, I was not a big fan. I thought it sounded too academic. But I was wrong about that because if there's anything that shows the truth of intersectionality, it's this case. It's the ideology of these defendants. They hate all of us. They hate African Americans. They hate Muslims. They hate immigrants. They're not too crazy about women. And most of all, which is the one part about the case that really shocked me, they really, really, really hate the Jews, which was so surprising to me because most of them, I think, live in rural communities where they probably don't even know any Jews. So the one thing that is absolutely clear is to defeat this, we all have to work together. Because they all see us as part of one big conspiracy. So we might as well work together to defeat their hate.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to bundle a couple questions. First is, could the trial be postponed because of the pandemic? Second is, who are the lawyers representing the neo-Nazis? And the third is, can you clarify what the hope in a victory is?
Well, so first of all, I mean, the lawyers are dropping like flies. I don't know if anyone's reading the press on this, but we might, by the time we get to trial, there might be no attorneys left in America willing to represent these guys. Richard Spencer's most recent counsel just withdrew on him. And this has happened with some of the other counsel in the case. So there are a couple lawyers left on the other side. At least one of them is a true believer and shares the defendant's ideology, and presumably that, you know, that's one of the things that's motivating him to do this, since he's not getting paid very much. Will the trial be postponed? So far it hasn't, and there are trials going forward in some jurisdictions in the country. I noticed a question over in the chat box. So this about where our trial is. Our trial is going to take place in the Western District of Virginia. That is the federal court district in which Charlottesville is located. And the Western District of Virginia really pulls from a large portion of Virginia. So including very rural areas and including Charlottesville itself. So we don't really know whether, you know, COVID will interfere, because of course, if we knew that, we would probably be solving a lot of medical problems for the country instead of just this legal issue. But we're proceeding apace as if we're going to trial in October. And I forgot your last question.
What is your hope?
What does victory look like? You know, I think we all might have different answers to that. But, you know, in my view, I really believe in the courts. I really believe in the justice system, and I really believe in juries. I think when you get up in court and you talk to jurors, you look at them in the eye, you know, generally they get together and they do the right thing. And, you know, I think we've already talked about some of the things we want out of this case. You know, we want discovery about these organizations, who runs them, how are they funded, and we want to break them down and bankrupt them. But at the end of the day, what will speak the loudest is when a jury of people from the Western District of Virginia who come into court with an open mind leave having delivered a verdict to say that these defendants are liable and that there is no place under the law for the activity that they have learned about in this case. And I think that, you know, at least for me, that is what constitutes victory here.
Robbie, what's victory for you?
Not surprisingly, it's not that different than Karen. I think we need to put on display for the jurors and hopefully for the American public what happened here, how it happened, the extent of it, and people need to hear that and see it and watch it on TV. And then I'm quite confident the jury will render a verdict in our favor. And we need, as a country, as a result, to decide to put the shame. Look, I'm cynical enough as a lawyer that I don't think we can eradicate racism and hatred and anti-Semitism completely, ever. But what we can do is make it pretty shameful, again, in America, for people to talk and act and do these things. And I'm hopeful that this trial and the verdict will be a step forward. And the only other thing I would note is I think these judges, we have a magistrate judge and a federal judge, Judge Moon. I think the judges, if they have any power to do so, will make sure that this trial happens as scheduled. They have made it very clear that they intend for this date to stick. Whether we have to use technology and Zoom for parts of it, we will. But we'll do everything we can to make sure this trial happens. And I think that's what the court wants.
Great, thank you. So there's a question asked about, are you worried about violence at the courthouse? And also what would it mean to stand in solidarity, in support, or against that kind of violence in a moment when the case goes to trial?
So I'm going to let Amy answer and say yes, but just to let you know how much this kind of is pervasive in the case. When Karen and I argued the motion to dismiss, we both wore bulletproof vests from the van that took us to the courthouse, about 50 feet into the courthouse. We had to take them off in the courthouse. The threat of violence is ever present, and we have to take it very, very seriously.
Yeah, there has been no shortage of threats against our legal team, including Robbie and Karen, our plaintiffs, who, as Robbie described earlier, we think are so incredibly brave for doing this, even more so because of the threats they face in doing it, and against IFA and our team. And so, to be completely straightforward, the biggest line item in IFA's budget is security. It's not a line item that exists in most civil litigation, as I'm sure Robbie and Karen can confirm, but it is one that exists here because of the fact that the defendants and their supporters have really tried to use fear and threats as a tactic to dissuade our team from moving this forward. And in many ways, I think that's so ironic because they are, you know, again, trying to undermine our plaintiffs' rights through the use of threats in a weird way. And so we are doing everything in our power to make sure our legal team, our plaintiffs, are kept safe. It's the most important thing we can do as we prepare for trial. And for folks, I saw a few folks asking in the chat, any donation that goes to Integrity First for America directly supports these case needs, including and especially the security costs. It all directly funds security, evidence collection, and other direct case needs that ensure our legal team will be safe, our plaintiffs will be safe, and that they will have everything they need to win at trial this fall.
Yeah. You know, I also just want to say we really appreciate the question because it takes into account the fact that, you know, we're human beings, and our plaintiffs are human beings who have already really, you know, suffered enough and have put themselves out there as plaintiffs in this case in order to so that we can litigate it and to make sure that everybody knows what happened in the first place. And that is going to be a difficult event and in some ways re-traumatizing for them to tell their stories on the stand. And the last thing that really we would wish for them is to worry additionally about their security. And, you know, this is a case about, you know, it's effectively a case about organized violence and about, you know, inspiring other people to do violence. You know, one of my cases before this one, I represented the owner of Comet Pizza, which is the pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was the subject of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory, where somebody read about that online and drove from North Carolina with an AR-15 to the restaurant, you know, and fired. So we are well aware of the challenges here. And, you know, we don't like to go too much into the details of the security that we're going to have, but we will make sure that we and the plaintiffs and our witnesses and everybody are secure.
Thank you. So I just want to kind of honor the fact that many people said, how can we help? So I know that Allison put in the chat the link for support of IFA. And I guess, so the second question I would ask, beyond financial support, are there other things leading up to the case that people could get involved with IFA or in support of the work? And second question is, in terms of like, what's the publicity line in IFA? How are you getting media coverage and spreading the word?
I'll start with the second one first, just because I think it's the quicker one. We are fighting tooth and nail to make sure that this case gets the attention it deserves. I think in normal times, something like this would be in the news almost every week. We are living at a time where a tweet from the president can totally derail the news cycle. And so that there's a little wrench in it, but I think we have been very proud of the attention the case has gotten to date. And I think that speaks to the fact that despite the craziness of the moment we're living in, this case is one that will have national implications, is so critical for the reasons we described, and is something that people should be paying attention to. And you will, don't worry about whether or not there will be updates available during trial. Both IFA will be providing daily updates to anyone who's on our list and on our social media. And of course, we will be fighting tooth and nail to ensure every media outlet that should be covering this does so. So absolutely, there is a plan, and we are IFA, that is a big part of IFA's work as we get closer to trial. In terms of what folks can do, Certainly donate, as I described, that directly supports this case, but there's so much more. Spread the word. On our website, there's an activist toolkit. We can also drop it in the chat if it's not there already. There's sample social media content, sample email content there that you can use to put information about this on your social media. Send an email to your networks, to your family, your friends, your colleagues, anyone who might be interested in this. There's also a clergy toolkit. I know we have a number of clergy members who might be on this. And in fact, a little preview. I know that Rabbi Sol and Pastor Dosha are going to be hearing from me on this later this week, but a little preview. We are working on a push from interfaith clergy around the anniversary of Charlottesville next month. And so we think interfaith clergy in particular are such critical voices here because houses of worship and faith communities have been on the front lines of these white supremacist attacks. So there's that. There's a social media toolkit. There's so much more that you can do, as Robbie and Karen and I have all talked about. Making sure that we're calling out white supremacy is key. And I think it's so easy to feel helpless and angry and scared in a moment like this. This case provides a tangible, concrete thing that someone can get involved with to fight back that will have very real financial, legal, and operational consequences on the leaders and the groups that are at the center of this movement, and really allow for people, whether you're watching or whether there are folks in your network that you know want to get involved, to get directly engaged in something that is tangible and concrete. So please sign up, donate, spread the word. We are grateful for whatever folks can do. We have a series of other virtual events coming up over the course of the next few months in the lead up to trial, including a number around the anniversary next month. So if you are on our list, you'll get notification for those and can invite your friends and family as well. And again, we're just so grateful for everyone who took some time out of their evening to learn about this. When you think about neo-Nazis all day, it's really refreshing to be in a virtual room of people who are supportive and eager to help. So thank you all. Great.
I think we'll come to a conclusion. I want to ask one last question to close of all the panelists. And I want to ask, what's your greatest hope right now? And what's your greatest fear?
Okay. So I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And I think a lot about what my grandparents lived through and the resources they did and did not have in the 30s and 40s when they were facing the unthinkable, and their families were not as lucky as they were. But what gives me hope is that we live in a time where we do have a justice system. We have the rule of law. We have statutes like the civil rights statutes, the Ku Klux Klan Act, that our legal team is brilliantly using here. And so that gives me hope. My greatest fear is that when this is over, when, whether it's our trial or whether it is the cycle of media coverage after the next white supremacist attack, we'll move on and we don't do the work that's required to truly dig into the fight against white supremacy that this so desperately needs, as Robbie and Karen also talked about earlier. So don't move on from this. Support the case, spread the word, but also keep making sure that your elected officials, your community, your friends and family know that white supremacist violence is one of the most dire threats to our communities, to our national security, to our democracy, and keep sounding that siren.
I think my greatest hope is what we're seeing, all the young people we're seeing on the streets today, the kinds of protests we're seeing against the endemic racism and hatred that's so prevalent in our country, and the courage of people, kids, to come out night after night after night to show their support and their opposition to so much of what's going on in our country today. I think my greatest fear is kind of the opposite, is that this genie is now out of the bottle, and I'm afraid we won't be able to put it back in. My goal in this trial is to put the genie back in the bottle. At least for a long time, we lived in this country without Nazis, kind of committing violence on our streets for a very long time, and I'd like to create those years again in the future for my son and hopefully his children.
My greatest hope is a vaccine for the coronavirus. That's my honest answer. I think, Robbie always says that, like, these guys, they all used to be in their basements, playing video games. And now I feel like we're all in our basement
That's true.
playing video games. And I think, which is terrible for so many reasons, including like all of the public health reasons. But I also think it is creating a crucible in this country that we can't contain right now. And so I agree with Amy and Robbie. I think my greatest fear is that, we reach a point where it's much harder to solve the problem than it ever had to be. And so we're working really hard to make sure we don't reach that point. And I think, I look forward to the day where we can all emerge from the basements, and work together in more interactive ways with each other. Because I think, it is, as society, that is what we need. It's very similar to what Robbie said, like we all are in this together. It's very hard to feel that way when we're going through a very isolating societal moment.
Thank you. I just want to recognize all our partners in this evening tonight, besides Integrity First for America, obviously, Bridging Cultures Group, Jewish Theological Seminary, Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies, Marlene Myerson, JCC, Muslim Community Network, St. Paul and St. Andrew United Methodist Church, Park Avenue Christian Church, Romamu, and Women's Islamic Initiative in Spirituality and Equality. And I, in many ways, I think we're hoping that, first of all, I just want to say, when you came to BJ a year and a half ago, it was in February, I believe. And at a time, I think, when we were incredibly depressed about the landscape of the country, which I don't know is any different in a certain sense, but I know that I felt in that moment of hearing you speak, and many in the room felt like that there was a shining light, there were ways actually that had impact to change the story and make hate be accounted for in ways that could stop it, or at least put the genie back to some degree. And I think it was like for me, a moment in time that, like, we're all living in our particular unique roles, your roles as lawyers, Amy's roles as the executive director of Integrity First for America, of thinking like, what is my role in making the society what it needs to be and combating the hatred that is so impactful on all of us in the nature of the country. And so I really want to thank you for your commitment, your perseverance, and your real smarts, obviously, which I don't need to tell you, but the sense of not only what you're doing, but kind of how you shine the light to say this is actually, we can do something about this. We don't have to just let it sit and rest. And I think when we imagined this evening and the partnership across faith traditions is to say, many ways white supremacists are trying to tear us apart. Part of their goal is actually to say, let Jews be afraid only for Jews. And let African Americans, who, by the way, many of which are Jews, and let us fight each other rather than white supremacists. And that's part of their tactic, is to say we should be divided and spend our time worrying about each other rather than fighting a grand hatred in this country, which is disabling the vision of what America, at least in my mind, I was taught to be, with all its imperfections and its flaws. And so, as we're almost 300 people on this call, and all the ways that this case has awakened us, and many others have awakened us to the ways that we have to bind together to say no, no matter which group is being marginalized in a given moment. And if America collectively can do that with all of us who care deeply about the nature of love and possibility and commitment to what this country, at least in a theoretical, stood for, even if our founding fathers had no grand vision of what that meant for everyone, because they too were flawed, then we can move together. And so I hope and pray that this case will be one of many that we see we can actually make the change, that there are wins to have, and that we won't desist in our possibilities of fighting this profound hatred and that we will push that genie back in its place. And we thank you profoundly for your commitment, and we hope that this evening, for all those who are on the call, that people will consider supporting IFA and looking to move in your communities and whatever reach that you have to tell this story, to get people connected, and to become activists for the cause. And finally, I just feel a deep sense of always moved by how you are holding so deeply a vision for this country that I think we're all praying for, and feel that we might be losing a little bit, but that we're not willing to let it go, and that we're going to hold together through it all. So thank you once again to Amy, to Robbie, to Karen, to Pastor Kaji, and to Serena and Mayrav and Allison, for all the folks at IFA, and to all the communities that have partnered for this effort. And we will keep persisting and supporting this work and a vision for America that lets all people be free and not fearful of violence. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Have
so
a good
much,
night.
Rabbi.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
So much.